I'm Justin Glaw, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Meta has decided to do away with fact-checking, setting up its platforms to help create more societal disasters than it already has. Today I'm talking with Katie Paul, director of the Tech Transparency Project. Katie has been documenting the disastrous effects of Meta's platforms for the better part of a decade, and today we'll talk about the company's latest move to eliminate its fact-checking program just as the second Trump administration is about to kick off. All right, Katie, let's start with the news about Facebook ending its fact-checking program. And I guess my first question is, it doesn't seem like the fact-checking program was really functioning that well to begin with. So is this even that big of a deal, or is this going to sort of ramp up the radicalization engine that is Facebook as we know it?
Well, when we're talking about Facebook's fact checking program, I think it's important to look at it outside of the context of the United States as well. Certainly, that's where we're looking at the influence issues with regard to Meta and Mark Zuckerberg and the incoming administration. But the fact checking program has been a really critical resource, particularly where Facebook is used abroad as a primary communications tool. There are many, many incidents internationally where real world harm has been caused by misinformation that was circulating. So, for instance, the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, the UN found Facebook played a critical role in fomenting that genocide because it helped promote misinformation broadly and actually had no Burmese speaking fact checkers at that time. Similarly, when we look at India, there have been incidents of lynchings as a result of misinformation that's gone unchecked and circulated. So the implications of the fact checking disappearing when we look at it globally are very important and serious. That said, I think the fact checking is just one piece of the downfall we're seeing with regard to Meta and the rollback of many of their content moderation policies. Although many policies weren't effectively enforced, but rolling back those policies is a clear indicator that the platform is going to become more of a free for all than it already is.
Right. And I think I saw something about how this, in the last year or couple of years or whatever, there was this deprioritization of political content on Meta platforms. And, there were people talking about how, they weren't able to really even discuss like political matters. When they rolled out Threads, it was supposed to be this Twitter alternative. But of course, if you can't really have anybody seeing you discuss politics, then it's kind of like makes Threads not really worthwhile or whatever. And I think that part of, if correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that deprioritization is now ending. So along with the reduction in fact checking, we're going to allow for the proliferation of political content. I mean, it seems like gas on the fire, right?
It's not just an issue of gas on the fire. Look, politics, social media has really burgeoned all over the world as a result of political discourse. And let's think in the context of how Mark Zuckerberg and Joel Kaplan have framed this rollback of moderation policies, including the deprioritization of politics. Notably, when they did the deprioritization, it wasn't reducing the priority of misinformation in politics. The fact that the platform wasn't effectively keeping up with its moderation on hate speech, political misinformation, all of those things, meant that it was just easier for them to deprioritize politics than to actually do the job they claimed they were doing at the time with regard to enforcing those things. And then when we take that into the context of the way that this announcement was framed as a move more toward free speech, really echoing what we've seen Elon Musk do with Twitter in the Twitter X, in the rollback of those policies in the name of free speech. Really what we're seeing is Mark Zuckerberg saying, well, okay, we deprioritized politics before, that didn't work, so now we're just gonna, it's a matter of free speech, like we're just gonna let everything go. There is a a happy medium to be had here, but this is also part of a bigger issue of the platform not doing the things it's been claiming it's doing, and framing the failures of those things as a reason to stop some of these programs. And so ultimately, that is the bigger context we have to keep in mind, and not just the piece by piece of what they announced in this new change.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't help but think of Facebook's moves in relation to politics and elections and presidential administrations. I mean, if you look at the history since 2016, it's been this kind of like up and down roller coaster of all these different things that they've tried and then have done away with or didn't really try. I mean, it started with the Cambridge Analytica madness. Then in 2020, it was, they saw how bad that was, and some other factors were involved with it, and they said, well, we're going to do this. They rolled out this voter registration thing, right? And then that sort of backfired. Republicans attorneys general got on him about that, so then that was gone, right? Okay, we're not doing that anymore. And then after 2020, well, we're going to deprioritize political content because, like, I think you're right in noting that, like, part of that was because they didn't want to do the job of having to fact check all of the misinformation that comes as a result of political content. And now this, which clearly looks to me like a capitulation of, Trump and like the right wing noise about like social media censoring conservatives and things like that. JD Vance is big on that. So it's just like this up and down, and it seems like it always kind of just goes further and further to like capitulating right wing politicians and figures and that whole sort of sphere. And I'm just wondering, like, does this feel like a company that is reacting to outside forces of politics, or does this feel like a company that's like actually making all these decisions on its own?
Looking at the history of Meta and Facebook, and just even the existence of content moderation policies in the first place, all of it is a reaction to outside forces, whether political or not. So think about 10 years ago now when there were ISIS beheading videos circulating on Facebook. The company didn't even have policies banning that at the time because they didn't have policies. And then
Mm,
the more that we see in the policies that they do have, many of them were specific reactions to public relations crises. So they
mm.
would change a policy and then they'd tell the media, we have a policy banning this thing. And ultimately, even if they don't enforce that policy, they were able to just respond and say, oh, well, we created a policy or we have a policy, no matter whether or not there was any responsibility for enforcing of that. So the entire history of the content moderation were these policies put in place to be able to say that, all of it ultimately to stave off the potential of Section 230 regulation, which is what the company has thrived on, not just Facebook, but really any of these big tech platforms have thrived on and been able to grow to the scale they have because of the protections afforded by Section 230. Now,
Yeah.
what we're seeing and what we saw, I think, after 2020 is that even though we have historic bipartisan support for Section 230 reform, it hasn't come. That change hasn't happened. So if you're a big tech company, why bother spending the money on fact checking and content moderation when ultimately you were spending that money to stave off regulation? If the regulation's not coming and there are no negative repercussions, either financial, criminal, or civil, why bother spending the money on that? And that's exactly what we're seeing happen now.
But I mean, hasn't Section 230 been also used by conservatives and Republicans as a cudgel, a sort of threat to say, we're going to actually look into enforcing this if you guys don't, in their words, in the words of Republicans, like stop censoring conservatives and things like that. So if like that threat isn't as present as maybe it has been in the past, then why does Zuckerberg feel like he even needs to come out right now? I mean, this just feels to me just like a straight up like, oh, Trump won the election. We're going to do this thing that benefits Trump. Like it seems like it's that cut and dry.
Well, it's not even just that. When you look at just a week or two ago before this, the announcement of Joel Kaplan to take over for Nick Clegg's role as global policy manager. Joel Kaplan has for many years worked on the right. He's connected to Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court justice, and this is really Zuckerberg positioning the company and himself to, appeal to the administration in whatever
Mhm.
way they may need to. Not just because of the regulations, but also remember that a competing platform's owner is now really attached at the hip to Trump and may
Mhm.
hold a position in the incoming government. If that's the case, and we've seen over the past year or two the very public uh, digital sparring between Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Were they going to fight each other for a UFC match? Were they not going to fight
Right.
each other? They were kind of throwing digital comments back and forth. Clearly, there was animosity there. And so the last thing somebody like Zuckerberg wants to do is leave his platform open to the potential of regulation from somebody who's not just a competitor, but in the public sphere has appeared to be kind of an opponent of him and of his own platform. So this is something broader than just the politics. I mean, there's also the kind of Silicon Valley sparring happening within this administration. And that's something else to keep in mind. But ultimately, we're seeing a lot of pay for play happening across the tech sphere. All of the big tech CEOs have donated $1 million to the inauguration fund for the incoming president. It's pretty clear that there are efforts to appease uh, the incoming administration in whatever means that may be, particularly when we consider the DOJ case against Google and the antitrust violations over the past year. That was a huge case, and that kind of broke the ceiling for what could happen to big companies that have faced antitrust claims like Meta and Apple.
Yeah, and in addition to the sparring directly between Zuckerberg and Musk, it's almost like, I wonder if there is an element here of like a race to see which platform can benefit Trump the most. And I mean, like, that's clearly, like, in my mind, Facebook has the potential to be much more beneficial to Trump than just because of its user base, right? And so I kind of wonder, like, what is the concrete results of the lack of deprioritization, for lack of a better term, of political content on Facebook, and this now reduction or completely doing away with fact checking. I mean, I think that Facebook has already been probably one of, if not the biggest drivers of sort of radicalization and like a rightward shift amongst a major subset of the population. Like, is how much worse can it get? Like, is this going to just straight up be like a major propaganda arm of the Trump campaign, or is this more just sort of Musk, or I'm sorry, Zuckerberg trying to say like, look, we're on your side. You can say whatever you want, and we have a bigger reach than even Musk does. So maybe give us a little bit of fairer treatment here.
I mean, I'm sure it's more of the latter, but ultimately, until the administration is officially inaugurated and we see the wheels start turning for what direction things are going, it's going to be kind of unclear. Now, when we think about the fact that Meta has prioritized or deprioritized political stuff, what we have to remember is this entire time they've been making lots of money from political advertising. That
Mm.
is not well moderated. In fact, a lot of our research over the past year has shown that their advertising is far less effectively moderated than it looks like on the platform, where they're running ads not just for political scams that are being labeled as political advertising, but also running ads for drugs like cocaine, for gun trafficking, and illegal machine gun switches. That's just their advertising arm, that's their primary revenue arm. So, lifting the political, whether or not it's prioritized, all they're kind of doing ultimately is they're going to open back up the data situation for who's going to see how much stuff, they're going to click on it. But again, Facebook's value and Meta's value here, let's look beyond Facebook for one. I think Instagram is a really important part of this too, because that's part of the platforms, the company's appeal to the younger generation.
Right.
And we know that a lot of young people get their news from social media platforms. And as Instagram is trying to keep up with and compete with TikTok, we also have to look at, where Mark Zuckerberg's, again, where the competitor aspects lie. We've seen Facebook and Meta's lobbying arm American Edge run, I'm in the DC area, so I see ads all the time that are targeting politicians and, that are run by lobbies. And for years, they've run ads that are these China scare ads. China's going to threaten American technological innovation. And much of it was aimed at creating a China scare to stop the rise of TikTok, which is their primary competitor, particularly in the youth demographic. And so now, as Trump has talked about, well, maybe we see what goes on with TikTok. All of a sudden, you see Mark Zuckerberg make this announcement about all of these changes that, from what we know about Meta's and Facebook's US user base at the moment, appear to benefit the right. But again, until we see things rolling, we won't really know. But we also have to think about, the international policies that the Trump administration may or may not push, and how that would ultimately benefit, Meta and Mark Zuckerberg, and particularly with the China aspect.
Yeah, that's bringing up Instagram is important because, obviously I think that's key to their long-term success, and they're probably looking at it like that, right? I mean, eventually there's not going to be a bunch of older folks on Facebook anymore, right? So, I mean, what has there been too much focus on Facebook, and do we need to be looking at exactly what the algorithms are feeding people on Instagram, especially in terms of news and political information? Like, is that potentially an unexplored area of influence that's ongoing for a different set of the online population, and a younger one?
There absolutely needs to be more research into Instagram and the algorithms there. Just even based on the research that we've done and looking at Instagram about a year, 2 years ago now, it's 2025. We did a project at the time with ADL looking at neo Nazi content and conspiracy content on Meta's platforms. And in that experiment, we had adult accounts and a teen account. They all followed the exact same methodology, followed the same conspiracy terms like flat Earth or globalism or whatever, in the same order, everything. Only the teen account was pushed explicit neo Nazi content down to like Adolf Hitler speeches
Mm,
on Instagram. The adult accounts were not pushed any of that. And so there's clearly evidence for a different way that the platform algorithmically amplifies content to young people. And that certainly needs to be more explored, particularly when we're talking about things like youth radicalization. And this was, 2 years ago, this was before these rollbacks and changes. And so that's something that certainly needs more heavily explored. But at the same time, we're seeing platforms like Instagram make it harder and harder and harder to do research on these platforms. Even if you click on too many things too quickly, you'll get a warning that it reads you as a bot and you're blocked. So
mm.
manual research is becoming increasingly difficult, and that's by design because the results of these types of studies, no matter who's doing them, are often extremely damning and cited by policymakers as they seek to change these regulations on platforms.
Why would they amplify more extremist content more quickly to a younger user than they would to the older user? Because the older user is potentially less less susceptible to getting sucked into that, and they want the younger user to just keep clicking or something?
Without transparency into how the algorithms are designed, that's not something we can answer. And unfortunately, transparency is not something these companies are very friendly about. So that's, ultimately something that we need to look into more. There are a lot of factors that could be considered in that, everything from, what people of that age group tend to click on when searching for something, to, what it reads as interest of people under a certain age. ultimately, without transparency into the algorithms, that's not something that we're going to be able to see. But it is a really important factor when we are looking at the power of these platforms and how somebody, that is registering with Instagram as 16 years old can be taken from searches about globalism to neo-Nazi content and Adolf Hitler speeches. That's a pretty quick and rapid jump, and the fact that that happened, in one of our first studies looking at this kind of amplification is extremely concerning, and we know these algorithms are improving every single day in their targeting.
I want to bring it back to what you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, which is, obviously, I tend to think, and most Americans probably tend to think of this in terms of ourselves and our politics. But as you noted, there have been a lot of real world harms done by this. The Rohingya stuff. I think there was anti-Muslim mobs in India that had gotten sucked down rabbit holes of misinformation and attacked Muslims in India over unfounded. I can't even remember what it was, but I mean, people have been hurt and killed as a result of other folks getting really fired up of stuff that's been spreading on Meta platforms. And so, like, what does there's not really much chance of regulation here, but like, what do the chances of regulation and accountability look like outside of the United States, where perhaps other governments are looking at this a little bit differently?
Well, that's really an important point that we've seen when we look at the past year or two since the passing of the Digital Services Act in the European Union. Um, as American companies, it should be the United States that is a leader on these policy issues and these regulatory changes for these types of platforms. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. And in the absence of US leadership, we've seen the EU move forward with very specific, detailed investigations into these platforms. Really, what they've started with are antitrust violations, potentials of criminal activity, criminal harm. We've seen, these investigations are really in their infancy, but the threat of the EU, because it's not just a monolith, that we're talking about an entire region as a user base. There's a lot more risk for the company in any tech company when it comes to that. And so, for instance, there have been potential comments about antitrust violations for Facebook Marketplace in the
Mm,
EU. And as a result, now in the EU specifically, Facebook's going to start showing eBay listings in its feed in addition to Marketplace in order to try to thwart any of the consequences of those antitrust violations. So immediate change occurs when these platforms are threatened with potential regulatory or financially damaging fines. What we've seen countries issue fines before. We saw it with Brazil and WhatsApp, and recently Brazil and X.
yeah.
But usually those fines are so small, they're a month of revenue, a fraction of a month of revenue for these
Hmm.
companies. But with the EU, the fines are much larger. We're talking about a bigger swath of an entire region and not a single country. And so it makes the impact of those threats a lot more significant. Ultimately, we're going to continue to see the EU move forward on this, and that's really going to be the area to watch when it comes to who has the power to shift how these companies are operating. Even today, there's supposed to be a X Spaces community discussion between the AfD party in Germany and Elon Musk. And
Yeah.
German authorities and European authorities are watching very closely to see if that's going to be algorithmically amplified over other content, and may be considered interference in the German election. So these are the types of things that are going to be important for the US to watch as we move forward, and really lessons that American policymakers can take from what works and what doesn't as the EU leads that charge in American absence.
Right. I can't imagine that getting rid of Nick Clegg and replacing him with Kaplan is going to help Meta's relationships with EU authorities that actually, in a way, at least more so than US policymakers do, hold them accountable. Give me your final thoughts, I guess, on whether this is just sort of par for the course, the up and down that we talked about, Facebook just kind of going with the flow of whoever's in power in Washington, or whether this is another like rightward shift that I think is just going to keep pulling them farther and farther to the right and pulling its users over there as well.
Well, I think to see moving forward how things play out for these companies, keep an eye on quarterly earnings calls, especially during the first year of the incoming administration. Are
Mm.
these platforms earning absurd amounts more than they typically do? Are they earning less? My money is that it's probably going to be on a lot more, but we'll have to see. And ultimately, it's going to be the revenue that drives how these companies operate. They think right now what they're going to be doing and what Meta's doing is going to work in their favor, particularly on the revenue side. So we have to wait and see what their earnings look like as the new administration comes in and as we see the material effect of all of these rollbacks.
Good point. Katie Paul, Tech Transparency Project. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks so much, Justin.
Thank you for listening to American Doom. This podcast is just a part of my work as a writer and journalist. To keep up, or at least to try to, because chaos and speed are the two primary drivers of my work, you can subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just search for American Doom there, and you'll find the investigations and stories that I cover. Coming up on my newsletter are more dives into election deniers working as local election officials across the country. This is work I've been doing mostly by myself for the last 4 years, and it's not possible without your support. American Doom is the only place that you'll find reporting on local election denier officials. So if you support this effort to protect against threats to democracy, please subscribe to my newsletter, American Doom, on Substack. Thank you.